Lena Marwick lived a quiet life, never imagining that Evan Kersey, the man living just steps away, had been studying her every move. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. Mapleford had always been the kind of place where people felt safe without thinking twice. The streets were lined with tall oak trees, the kind that made shadows dance gently across porches during quiet afternoons. Families gathered on weekends, neighbors exchanged small favors, and almost everyone knew each other well enough to trust without hesitation. In this peaceful environment lived Evan Kersey, a man who blended so well into the background that most residents barely noticed him beyond a polite nod. He kept his life simple, walking his dog early in the morning, maintaining a small garden behind his house, and never involving himself in neighborhood drama. His detached calmness made him forgettable, and in Mapleford, being forgettable usually meant being harmless. Not far from Evan's house lived Lena Marwick, the town's soft-spoken librarian, known for her gentle nature and quiet routine. She lived alone, preferring the calm of books over loud gatherings. Her reliability made her a familiar face. She never missed work, never ignored her duties, and always greeted neighbors with a warm expression. People admired her kindness without knowing much about her personal life. But in a small town, calm predictability was enough to earn trust. Another resident, Mason Joyner, lived across the street from both Evan and Lena. Mason enjoyed observing the rhythm of the neighborhood from his front porch, often noticing small details others missed, like the exact time the mail arrived each day, or when certain lights turned on at night. Yet even Mason never saw anything unusual about Evan Kersey. During early mornings when the town was still half asleep, Evan walked his dog along the same path daily. He passed the Marwick home at nearly the same minute each morning, his steps steady and unchanging. Lena often left for work shortly after, preparing the library for students and locals who depended on her for book recommendations and research help. While their schedules overlapped, their lives never touched directly in any meaningful way. Still, Evan never failed to notice her movements, even if no one ever noticed him noticing. Behind this routine, Mapleford felt almost frozen in peaceful predictability. Children played outside with little supervision, families left windows open at night, and neighbors rarely felt the need to question the habits of others. The sense of safety was so deeply rooted that even strange events or odd behaviors were often brushed aside or rationalized as harmless. When Evan carried heavy bags to the curb on random days, people assumed he was cleaning out his garage. When he stayed up late with the backyard lights on, they assumed he was tending to his garden. No one thought twice, not even Mason Joyner, who usually spotted anything out of place. The calm atmosphere shaped the way people viewed each other. Evan Kersey was simply the quiet man with the dog. Lena Marwick was the dependable librarian. Mason Joyner was the observant neighbor with harmless curiosity. In Mapleford, everyone had a role, and everyone trusted that these roles would never change. But beneath this comfort, something darker was already forming, unnoticed and unchallenged. The town's strongest belief, that true danger could never live among them, was about to be proven terribly wrong, even though no one yet had a reason to suspect it. Lena Marwick's disappearance shook Mapleford in a way the town had never experienced. It began on a cool autumn evening, when the sun dipped behind the houses earlier than usual, and the air felt heavier than normal. Lena had finished her day at the library and returned home just after sunset. She followed her usual pattern, placing her keys in the small bowl by the door, turning on the warm lamp in her living room, and preparing a simple dinner. Everything inside her home looked untouched, exactly as she would have left it. Yet by the next morning, she was nowhere to be found. Her absence was first noticed by her coworker, Elise Renner, who arrived at the library early and found the front door locked, the lights off, and no sign of Lena's familiar presence. Lena had never missed a morning shift without informing someone. Concern grew quickly, and Elise contacted the police before noon. News spread faster than anyone expected. Mason Joyner heard about it from a neighbor as he watered his lawn, and the worry on people's faces told him this wasn't a small misunderstanding. Even Evan Kersey, who rarely interacted with anyone, stepped outside and looked down the street more than usual that day, although his expression remained unreadable. Police visited Lena's house within hours. Her car sat neatly in the driveway. Her phone rested on her kitchen table, still connected to the charger. A half-prepared meal lay on her counter, as if she had stepped away for just a second. There was no broken glass, no forced entry, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest a struggle. It was the kind of disappearance that seemed impossible in such a predictable town. Officer Dana Kellen led the early search efforts, organizing groups of volunteers to comb through nearby parks, trails, and wooded paths. Mason joined the search, walking with a flashlight long after the sun set again. He kept replaying the previous night in his mind, trying to recall if he had noticed anything unusual. He had sat on his porch for a while, listening to the quiet hum of distant traffic, but nothing had stood out. He couldn't even remember seeing Lena's lights turn off, though he usually noted such details without effort. While the search continued, whispers grew among the residents. People began locking their doors earlier than normal and checking their windows twice. Parents called their children indoors sooner, and even the friendly routines of waving to neighbors felt strained by fear. Mapleford, a place that had always felt safe, suddenly seemed uncertain and fragile. Evan Kersey maintained his usual routine during those days, which some neighbors found strange in itself. He walked his dog at the same hour, kept his head down, and never joined the search groups. Mason noticed this from across the street and wondered why Evan showed no visible concern. Still, he dismissed the thought quickly. Evan had always been distant, and some people simply processed worry differently. Days passed with no progress. The police questioned everyone who lived near Lena, including Evan, but nothing led to answers. With each passing hour, the sense of dread tightened its grip around Mapleford. The idea that someone could vanish without a trace, especially someone as steady and gentle as Lena, felt impossible. Yet the truth was even more chilling. Whatever had happened to her had occurred silently, right among them, without a single witness, and although no one knew it yet, the person responsible continued moving through the neighborhood as calmly as ever, hidden behind an ordinary face that no one thought twice about. Strange details began surfacing in the days following Lena Marwick's disappearance, although none of them seemed alarming at first. Mapleford was the kind of place where people noticed small changes simply because there weren't many big ones. The first to sense something was wrong was an elderly resident named Marcia Glenwood, who lived 2 houses away from Evan Kersey. She mentioned to her sister over the phone that Evan's backyard lights had been staying on unusually late, sometimes until dawn. Marcia had always paid attention to the neighborhood's nighttime rhythm, and this shift unsettled her. She thought Evan might be working on a project or dealing with some personal issue, but the timing right after Lena went missing didn't sit well with her. On the opposite end of the street, Mason Joyner noticed something different too. On the morning after Lena vanished, he saw Evan carrying 2 large trash bags to the curb. Normally, Evan brought out small bags neatly tied and placed carefully inside the bin. These were heavier, sagging oddly, and he dragged them rather than lifted them. Mason watched from a distance, trying not to let his imagination drift into dark assumptions. People were stressed, routines shifted, and Mason reminded himself that Evan had always been quiet and private, not suspicious. Still, the details added up in a strange way. A faint smell began drifting from behind Evan's shed, a sharp, unpleasant odor that Marcia assumed was a dead raccoon or some other animal. Mapleford's wooded edges often brought wildlife close to homes, so no one questioned it. Yet the smell lingered longer than expected, growing stronger with each passing night. Another unsettling observation came from a teenager named Colin Ferris, who biked past Evan's house every evening after finishing his part-time shift at a local cafe. He noticed Evan standing behind his shed one night, barely visible near the shadows of the trees. Evan wasn't doing anything, just standing still facing the ground, his posture stiff and unnatural. Colin slowed his bike but kept moving, telling himself not to overthink it. Adults had their strange habits. It wasn't his place to question them. Even the dogs in the neighborhood reacted strangely when walking near Evan's yard. A golden retriever belonging to the Harris family refused to pass the side of Evan's property, pulling hard on its leash until its owner took another route. Over the years, Mapleford residents had learned to trust the instincts of animals, but with fear spreading after Lena's disappearance, many chalked it up to nervous energy. All these small signs floated around town like disconnected pieces of a puzzle no one realized they were solving. Each person noticed something, but no one shared their concerns with the next. People didn't want to seem paranoid during an already tense time. They wanted to believe that Mapleford was still the safe place it had always been. The idea that someone among them, someone familiar, might be involved in something sinister was too heavy for most to consider. Meanwhile, Evan continued his daily routines with a calmness that felt almost unnatural compared to the rising anxiety around him. He walked his dog at the same pace, trimmed his hedges with the same precision, and avoided eye contact with anyone who might look too closely. He kept himself wrapped tightly in the comfort of normal behavior, making sure no one looked at him long enough to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. No one understood yet that these strange signs were not random. They were warnings, scattered in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect them. But until someone did, the truth stayed buried, both literally and figuratively, behind the quiet walls of Mapleford, where danger hid itself in the routine of an ordinary man everyone assumed they knew. The break in the case arrived unexpectedly, triggered by a man who had no direct link to Lena Marwick, but happened to be in the right place at the right time. His name was Travis Olander, a local jogger who followed the same forest trail every morning before work. On the 8th day of Lena's disappearance, Travis noticed something he had never seen before: a torn piece of dark fabric stuck to a branch near Mapleford Creek. It wasn't unusual for hikers to snag their clothing on branches, but something about the fabric made him pause. It looked new, not weathered, and the tear seemed recent. The fabric's color and texture matched what he had seen on posters around town describing Lena's last known outfit. Travis reported it to Officer Dana Kellen, who immediately sent a team to comb the area more thoroughly. The creek's surroundings were quiet, lined with fallen leaves and thin paths people rarely used. As officers searched the ground, they found faint footprints too blurred to identify, but clearly belonging to an adult. The prints led toward the residential area, not away from it. This discovery changed the direction of the investigation. Until then, many believed Lena might have been taken by someone passing through town, maybe a stranger who would never return. But these footprints witnessed something more chilling. Whoever was involved had walked back into the neighborhood as if nothing had happened. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Mason Joyner heard it from a police volunteer who stopped by his home to ask more questions. Mason felt a deep uneasiness settle in his chest. He replayed the nights before Lena disappeared, trying to remember if he had heard or seen anything unusual, any movement, any shadow, any sound that felt out of place. But he found nothing solid, only a growing sense that the danger was closer than anyone wanted to believe. Meanwhile, Officer Kellen reviewed all security camera footage submitted by residents. Mapleford wasn't a town filled with high-tech surveillance, but a few houses had doorbell cameras. One belonged to the Porters, a couple living 2 streets away from Lena. Their footage showed a shadowy figure walking behind Lena's home on the night she vanished. The figure moved slowly, with a familiar rhythm, almost like someone strolling late at night. The camera quality was too low to reveal a face, but the pattern of movement was distinct. When compared to footage recorded by Mason's door camera of Evan Kersey walking his dog, something matched: the gait, the posture, the slight tilt of the head. Officer Kellen didn't jump to conclusions, but the resemblance made her uneasy. Evan had already been questioned briefly, like most neighbors, and his answers were polite, controlled, and emotionless. At the time, his calmness had been interpreted as normal behavior for a reserved man. Now it felt different. It felt like someone carefully hiding something. As the police prepared to revisit the homes closest to Lena's, Another detail pushed them further. A ranger who maintained trails near the creek mentioned seeing a man in dark clothing walking away from the woods late at night a few days earlier. He couldn't identify the person, but the description, height, build and movements once again resembled Evan. Small pieces were beginning to align, forming a quiet but undeniable path that pointed directly towards someone Mapleford barely paid attention to. No one had expected the investigation to lead back to their own neighborhood, let alone to a man whose presence had always been so silent it almost didn't exist. But as each clue fell into place, the truth started taking shape, bringing the town one step closer to a discovery that would shatter every sense of safety they once believed in. The truth behind Lena Marwick's disappearance began to take shape when Officer Dana Kellen and her team looked deeper into the small but suspicious details that surrounded the case. The more they revisited the clues, the more a single name kept reappearing in unexpected ways: Evan Kersey. He had lived in Mapleford for years without ever drawing attention, yet the investigation slowly revealed patterns that couldn't be ignored. The security footage showing a figure with a gait similar to his was the first major threat, but it was what came next that began to unravel the calm, ordinary image he had crafted. One afternoon, Officer Kellen organized a second wave of interviews, focusing on residents living closest to the creek where Travis Olander found the torn piece of fabric. During these interviews, a resident named Henry Blakemore mentioned something he had previously overlooked. Henry often walked his dog late at night, and a few evenings before Lena disappeared, he had seen Evan leaving the trail area near the creek around 11 p.m. It struck Henry as unusual because Evan normally kept a strict early morning schedule and was rarely outside after sunset. At the time, Henry assumed Evan was simply taking his dog for a late walk. But the dog wasn't with him that night. Evan was alone, moving quickly, avoiding streetlights as if he didn't want to be seen. This detail stayed with Officer Kellen. When she cross-referenced the time Henry mentioned with the timeline of Lena's final hours, the overlap became unsettling. Evan had no reason to be near the creek that late. At least none he had shared during his first interview. Kellen added it to the growing list of inconsistency. Days later, another unexpected source came forward: a delivery worker named Soren Hale. He recalled delivering a package to Evan's doorstep 2 days after Lena vanished. When he knocked, Soren heard hurried movement inside, followed by silence. Evan eventually opened the door, looking tense and oddly flushed. Instead of taking the package normally, he grabbed it quickly and closed the door almost before Soren could step off the porch. While not evidence of a crime, Soren found Evan's behavior memorable, unusual enough that it remained in his mind until news about the investigation intensified. Meanwhile, Kellen decided to examine the notebooks found during the initial search for clues. These notebooks were filled with observations Evan had made about his neighbors, times they left for work, how long they stayed out, when they returned, and even notes describing what they wore on certain days. One notebook focused disturbingly on Lena. It detailed her routines with unsettling precision. The entries grew more obsessive in the months leading up to her disappearance. The writing shifted from simple notes to more emotional statements, hinting at fixation, frustration, and a desire for control. The deeper Officer Kellen read, the more she understood the truth. Evan hadn't simply watched people. He studied them. He memorized their lives. And he had been watching Lena more closely than anyone imagined. This evidence painted a chilling picture. Evan's quiet personality was not harmless. It was a mask. His calm demeanor hid a mind that had grown increasingly fixated on a woman who never suspected she was being watched. His small, unnoticed behaviors, late-night walks, strange activity behind his shed, heavy trash bags, lights left on at odd hours were no longer random events. They were pieces of a larger, darker pattern. The motive began to surface as investigators pieced together the notebooks with Evan's movements. His fixation had twisted into resentment when Lena failed to acknowledge him the way he wanted. This resentment simmered quietly, unnoticed by everyone around him, and when it finally reached its breaking point, Mapleford had no warning. The town still believed it was searching for a missing woman. But the truth, now slowly uncovering itself, hinted at something far worse. Something that would alter Mapleford's sense of safety forever. The search of Evan Kersey's property marked the turning point that Mapleford had feared yet desperately needed. It began early in the morning, when Officer Dana Kellen and her team arrived with a warrant and quiet determination. Rumors spread quickly through the neighborhood as patrol cars lined the street. Residents peered from behind curtains, whispering to each other in disbelief. Evan, who had spent years blending into the background, was now at the center of unexpected attention. The officers moved methodically, starting with the inside of the house. Evan's living room was spotless, almost unnaturally organized. Books were arranged by height, surfaces cleared, drawers meticulously sorted. There was nothing personal, no photos, no decorations, no signs of hobbies or social life. It felt like a house designed to look normal rather than lived in. When the team entered his bedroom, they noticed the same unsettling pattern. A life too empty, too controlled, as if every trace of emotion had been removed. But the real discoveries were waiting outside. Behind Evan's house stood a weathered wooden shed, its paint peeling and its door slightly warped from years of humidity. To most neighbors, it was just an old storage structure, no different from any other in Mapleford. Yet Officer Kellen felt drawn to it from the moment she stepped into the yard. Something about the shed felt off. Perhaps the way the soil around it looked disturbed, or how the air carried a faint, sour odor that lingered the closer one walked toward it. The officers approached carefully, noting the fresh shovel marks in the dirt. When they opened the shed door, they found gardening tools lined neatly on the walls, but it wasn't the tools that drew their attention. It was the floor. A section of it had darker stains, barely visible but impossible to overlook. Officer Kellen ordered a forensic team to examine the area while she inspected the yard more closely. Not far behind the shed, the ground appeared uneven. The soil was softer, the grass disrupted, as if recently dug up and hastily covered again. The forensic team began digging, each shovel of dirt revealing more of the truth the town had hoped not to face. A few inches down, they uncovered a piece of fabric, similar to the kind Lena Marwick had been wearing the night she vanished. Digging continued until items began to surface: a necklace, a wristwatch, and a shoe that neighbors recognized instantly as Lena's favorite pair. No one wanted to believe what they were seeing, but denial was no longer possible. Inside the house, another chilling discovery unfolded. In a hidden compartment beneath Evan's desk, officers found a locked metal box. Inside were small objects that didn't belong to him. Personal items belonging to various neighbors. Some were harmless, like a keychain or a button, but others were more disturbing: strands of hair, photos taken without the owner's knowledge, and folded pages containing detailed observations. The notebooks found earlier had been unsettling, but this evidence revealed that Evan's compulsions extended far beyond Lena. He had been watching people for years, silently collecting fragments of their lives. As more evidence was gathered, Evan remained silent, sitting calmly as officers moved around him. He didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He simply stared at the floor, as if the world unfolding around him had nothing to do with him. To the officers, his lack of emotion was almost more disturbing than the evidence itself. For Mapleford, the discovery shattered every illusion of safety. Neighbors who once greeted Evan with polite smiles now felt betrayed by their own assumptions. They had looked past the strange habits and quiet behaviors because he never caused trouble, but the ordinary exterior they trusted had been carefully crafted, hiding a mind capable of unimaginable harm. The backyard discovery set the final stage. The truth was out, but the full story of how deeply Evan's obsession ran and how long it had gone unnoticed was only beginning to unfold. The investigation into Evan Kersey's life revealed a motive far more unsettling than anyone in Mapleford had imagined. While the town struggled to accept the evidence found behind the shed, Officer Dana Kellen and her team focused on unraveling the reasoning behind Evan's actions. They needed to understand the path that led a quiet, forgettable neighbor to commit such a horrifying act. What they uncovered painted a picture of obsession that had grown in silence long before Lena Marwick ever disappeared. The notebooks found in Evan's home became the first window into his mind. Pages filled with neat handwriting traced the daily lives of people around him, what time they left for work, when they returned, who visited them, and even how long it took them to complete simple tasks. Entries went back years. Some pages referenced residents who had moved away long before Lena ever came to Mapleford. Evan had been observing people not out of curiosity, but out of an intense need to understand and control. It wasn't explosive anger that drove him, it was cold fixation. Among all the entries, Lena's section stood out. The notes about her were more frequent, more detailed, and progressively more emotional. In the early months, Evan wrote about her routine, when she watered her plants, how often she checked her mail, what books she carried home from the library. But slowly, the writing shifted. He recorded moments that most people wouldn't even notice: the way the sunlight fell on her front porch, how she tucked her hair behind her ear, the color of her coat on rainy days. These were observations that hinted at growing infatuation, yet the obsession didn't stay quiet. Several entries showed frustration when Lena didn't behave the way Evan expected. A day she decided not to go for her evening walk drew an entire page of tense handwriting. If she closed her curtains earlier than usual, Evan wrote about feeling shut out. These emotional shifts grew sharper over time, transforming admiration into resentment. He began writing phrases that revealed a dangerous mindset, notes suggesting he believed he deserved her attention, that he understood her better than anyone else, that her independence felt like a personal insult. Investigators also discovered unsent letters Evan had written to Lena. None of them were addressed directly, and all were hidden carefully between notebook pages. The letters revealed fantasies of connection, followed by anger at imagined rejection. It became clear that Evan wasn't simply lonely. He had created an entire fictional relationship in his mind, one he believed Lena was failing to fulfill. The more evidence surfaced, the more horrifying the motive became. Evan's calm exterior had been masking a growing storm beneath the surface. He didn't lash out impulsively, he observed Lena long enough to know when she was alone, when she was vulnerable, and when he could act without being seen. His obsession with control, mixed with his belief that she owed him something, led to the fateful moment when he acted on thoughts he had nurtured in silence for months. To the town, the motive felt unreal. No one imagined that someone like Evan, the quiet neighbor who barely spoke, could carry such intense emotions without showing a single sign. Mason Joyner struggled the most with this realization. He had lived across from Evan for years and never sensed anything dangerous. Now he found himself replaying every silent wave, every polite nod, wondering how deeply Evan had been studying all of them. The tragedy forced Mapleford to confront a chilling truth. Danger didn't always arrive with loud footsteps or warning signs. Sometimes it grew quietly inside a person who blended perfectly into the background. Evan's motive wasn't born from sudden rage. It came from years of unnoticed isolation, fixation, and twisted logic that no one saw until it was far too late. And while investigators pieced the story together, the weight of the motive settled heavily over the community. It wasn't just the loss of Lena Marwick that haunted them, it was the unsettling realization that someone capable of such darkness had lived among them, unnoticed, watching them more closely than they ever imagined. Mapleford struggled to breathe in the days that followed Evan Kersey's arrest. The peaceful rhythm that once defined the town was replaced with an atmosphere of fear, disbelief, and quiet grief. Patrol cars lingered on every block, reporters arrived with cameras and loud questions, and neighbors spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid their voices might stir lingering shadows. The truth had shattered the illusion of safety, leaving the town unsure of how to return to normal. Yet the community needed answers, and the final details of the case came together as investigators combed through everything Evan had tried to hide. Evan was transferred to a nearby detention facility, while forensic experts worked on analyzing the evidence found in his home and yard. Officer Dana Kellen remained dedicated to uncovering every hidden layer of the crime. She spent long hours reviewing the notebooks, photographs, and personal items Evan had stolen from neighbors over the years. Each discovery felt like opening another door into his mind, revealing habits and intentions he had concealed so quietly that no one ever suspected him. The items tied to Lena Marwick were the most heartbreaking: her watch, her necklace, the small bookmark she kept in her coat pocket. These items made clear how close Evan had studied her life before taking it from her. Meanwhile, forensic specialists confirmed what many feared: the disturbed soil behind the shed held remains and belongings tied undeniably to Lena. The final confirmation left Mapleford in a state of collective mourning. Candlelight vigils appeared outside the library where Lena had worked, with flowers placed along the steps she used every morning. Her co-workers struggled to process the loss of a woman who had brought calm and kindness to everyone she met. Elise Renner, who had first sounded the alarm when Lena didn't show up to work, visited the vigil daily, unable to accept that her friend had suffered at the hands of someone who lived so close. The community's grief soon evolved into confusion and betrayal. Mason Joyner, in particular, grappled with guilt. He had watched the neighborhood every day, priding himself on his awareness of small details, yet he had missed the signs that were now painfully obvious. Mason found himself replaying each moment he shared the street with Evan: the quiet nods, the brief sightings, the times he noticed something strange but brushed it aside. The realization that he had lived across from a predator, someone capable of such violence, left him questioning his own instincts. As the trial approached, prosecutors assembled a compelling case based on Evan's notebooks, interviews, forensic evidence, and his pattern of obsessive behavior. Evan remained silent through most of the interrogations, showing no remorse and no emotional reaction. His stillness unsettled everyone who encountered him, as if he had detached himself completely from the reality of what he had done. He didn't contest the evidence, nor did he attempt to explain his actions. It was as though the quiet mask he wore for years had become permanent. When news of Evan's quiet confession finally reached Mapleford, the town felt both relief and heartbreak. There would be no drawn-out trial, no dramatic courtroom scenes, just a simple acknowledgement of guilt from a man who had never shown his true self. Evan was sentenced to life in prison without parole, ensuring he would never again walk the streets he had used as hunting grounds. But even with justice served, Mapleford could not return to what it once was. People locked their doors earlier. They paid closer attention to subtle changes. They stopped assuming that quiet meant harmless. Parents taught their children lessons about awareness that once felt unnecessary in a town so small. Conversations grew more cautious, and trust became something people protected more carefully. Lena Marwick's memory lived on in the library she loved. Residents created a small memorial section in her honor, filled with her favorite books and a plaque that described her warmth and devotion to the community. People visited the space often, leaving flowers or notes expressing sorrow and gratitude. It became a reminder of both the beauty Lena brought to the town and the darkness that had taken her away. In the end, Mapleford learned a harsh truth: danger doesn't always look like a stranger passing through a dark alley. Sometimes it looks like a quiet neighbor, someone who smiles politely, someone who never raises suspicion. The murder of Lena Marwick revealed that evil could hide in familiar faces, waiting in silence unnoticed until it was too late. And although life slowly moved forward, the town would never forget the killer who lived next door, or the woman whose loss changed Mapleford forever.